Good morning, and happy Easter. This Easter, like last Easter and the Easter before that and all the Easters, we come together and we hear the story of Jesus' resurrection, and you all keep showing up even though you already know how the story ends. Every Easter I wake up and I think it's going to be a miracle if anybody shows up this year, because it's the one Sunday of the year I can guarantee that everyone who's there knows the story, and you still come. In some ways, it's the most pressure and the least pressure I have all year in the pulpit. It's the most pressure because everybody expects Easter to be a knock out of the park, right? It's supposed to be the best Sunday service of the year, and in some ways, it's the least amount of pressure I'm going to feel all year because it's the same thing I say every year. He is risen. It's easy. It's the same story. And you know the story, and you could tell the story. We don't have to show it on the screen. We don't have to have someone read it to you. You know how this goes. You know that there's a tomb and a stone and an angel. Sometimes that angel is sitting on top. Sometimes that angel's already in the tomb, but there's an angel. There's some women. Odds are at least one of them's named Mary. One of those Marys is going to look in the tomb. One of those Marys is going to cry. One of those Marys is going to confuse Jesus and the gardener. You know the story. You know there's going to be some clothes lying in the tomb, folded up neatly. You know there's going to be lots of confusion. You know there's going to be some disciples racing to see who can get there faster. And more importantly, you know he's not there. The tomb is empty. He doesn't stay dead. Each year, those women come to the tomb, and those guards are there confused. Each year, the disciples race to see who gets there first, and each year, they're always surprised to find out he's not there. He's gone. Each year, they see the angels, they see the clothes, they see the stone, they see all of this. But Jesus, they don't see him. You know, for a story about a guy, he doesn't really make much of an appearance in this thing, does he? I mean, if we're talking main characters, and if we're going to sit here just a little bit in a literary critical kind of way, for a main character of a story, he's largely absent from like the most important bit, this resurrection. Just not there. It's a little bit odd. This Jesus, this main character, the guy who was dead and isn't dead, he's not in the tomb because now he's 5 steps ahead of everyone. He isn't just back from the dead, he's now ahead of everything. It seems like he's running just a little bit faster than everyone else, and everyone else is now playing catch up to find Jesus. He's always going to be ahead of them from this point forward. At the beginning of the Gospels, it's not that way. John the Baptist is sent in order to prepare the way for Jesus. In order to prepare the way for Jesus, you have to acknowledge the fact that he's not there yet. He's behind. He's running late. He's not there quite yet. John baptizes, he preaches, he teaches, he gathers disciples, he makes way for the kingdom of heaven is near. And before that, the people were always in this constant state of longing and waiting. It was this perpetual waiting room for Jesus to show up. Everyone was waiting generation after generation for the Messiah to come back, for the heir to David's throne to sit on the throne again. It was all the tension of waiting for the Lord of the Rings movie to end. Is the king ever going to take the throne? It was that, but for generation after generation after generation, this king is coming, the king is coming, but with every generation, he never came. Always late. So John gets there and makes ready, gets people excited again, because I think by the time that John shows up, if we're being totally honest, by the time that John starts saying that Christ is coming, everyone else laughed and said, "Oh, okay, sure. We've said that before, John." There was no trust that he was ever going to actually arrive. He was always not there. And now, after the crucifixion, after this resurrection, he's still not there. There's this sweet spot in between, right? There's thousands of years of waiting for this Jesus to be present, and he's present for like this little bit of time, and then now whenever things are really starting to get off the ground, he's gone again. Oh, to be one of the disciples who got to experience that sweet spot where Jesus was really there. But the majority of history, the majority of God's people have lived either expecting Jesus to show up or are living now in this time whenever he's already gone on. Easter is a strange little thing like that. After this crucifixion, after the resurrection, things have shifted. Because no longer are people preparing for Jesus. Jesus is now preparing for people. The role of host and guest has shifted. For the longest time, people were preparing themselves to host God on earth. And now Jesus has gone on with God to prepare for people in heaven. Host and guest, the roles are reversed. You can hear this language over time in some places better than others. If depending on where you go for church on a Sunday or a Saturday, you might come to a table that looks nothing like this, and somebody will hand you not matzah, they won't hand you bread, they won't hand you anything like styrofoam. Instead, they're going to call it host. Here's host. Because this idea that Jesus has gone on before us, gone ahead of us, his role has become one of host. Strange thing, Easter. Jesus has gone ahead to make preparations, whatever that means. I want you to notice here in this Easter story from Matthew 28, not necessarily the John story or the Mark story or the Luke story, but here in Matthew, the disciples find Jesus, and they really find him, and they grab him by the feet so he can't run away. They don't want this guy to disappear again. They're going to hold on to him. It's the same thing that kids do to their parents when they're at that age of 2 or 3 when they're toddlers, and they'll sit down on the ground and latch onto your leg and expect you to walk around with them like ankle weights, right? These disciples are grown men ankle weights around Jesus' legs. They've latched onto his feet. They're not going to let him go. And the very first thing he says to them is, I'm going. But not just anywhere. Jesus tells his friends, I'm going ahead of you. I'm going to Galilee ahead of you. Meet me there. But I'm going to get there first, and you're going to come next. But I'm going ahead of you. He's going ahead. And that's what Jesus has been doing ever since that resurrection, that first Easter. He's been going ahead. And he warned the disciples that this day was coming. He told them in so many words explicitly in John chapter 14. John 14, just the first 7 verses. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. And you know the way to the place that I'm going. But good old Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? And Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. So if you know me, you know my Father also. So from now on, you do know him and have seen him. And I imagine the disciples looked around at each other in total confusion and said, he's not going anywhere, he's still right here. In this weird moment, Jesus looks at his disciples and says, I'm going away, and then he doesn't leave. What do you do with that? Imagine you're hosting a dinner party and somebody stands up and says, well, it's about that time, gotta head home, and then they don't leave. What do? You can keep inching the conversation closer to the door, and you can try to kick them out, but you can't make somebody leave, not really. Jesus says he's going to go, but doesn't leave. He's like that dinner guest that just doesn't ever want to go. So by the time he does go, they don't believe it still. He's not really going. And even though here in John 14 he promises them, when I go, I'll take you with me. Here now at this empty tomb, Jesus says, I'm going ahead of you. Come find me. I'll be in Galilee. You know where to find me. Come find me. And this time they don't argue. They argue in John 14, and Thomas says, I don't know where you're going. How am I supposed to know? We don't have GPS. But this time in Matthew 28, there's no argument. They seem to know where Jesus is going. But I don't think so. I don't think that's it. I think this time Jesus just knows where they're going to go. He knows where they're going to be. And he's going to put himself there first. So this Easter, we gather not only to remember a story, but to remember that Jesus has gone ahead of us. He's gone on ahead of us into death so that when we die, we can do so with confidence, knowing that Jesus has conquered death. He did that first so that we wouldn't have to be afraid. And he's gone on ahead of us into resurrection so that we can be assured of our resurrection after death as well. He did that first so we could be confident. He's gone ahead of us into heaven to make room for us and to prepare for our arrival so that whenever our loved ones pass before us, we can have hope that they have found a home in heaven, ready and waiting for them. And he goes ahead of us in this life too, so that wherever we go, whatever we face, we can do so in the confidence that the one who conquered death is preparing for our arrival to whatever happens next. I've spent a fair amount of time in my career in hospital rooms, holding hands of those who die, holding the arms of those who watch others die. I've spent a fair amount of my time at funerals, seeing grief in its most direct forms. I've spent a lot of time meeting people in all sorts of places to hear them tell me all sorts of terrible news. You can always tell when it's coming. There's a bit of a program to it all. When you get one of those emails or phone calls or texts that says, hey, we need to talk, the first thing you do is wonder what you did wrong and what you said in last week's sermon that made the wrong person mad, or those kinds of things. But eventually you start to realize this person is going to unload something, some bit of news. And there's some preparations to be made for all of those events. Before you go to a hospital room to hold the hand of someone who's dying, there's things you do to prepare yourself for that moment. There are things that you do to prepare for a funeral. There are things that you do to prepare to be there for somebody, to listen to someone's life-altering news. You have to prepare in advance for those things. And the one thing I have learned over the years, more assuredly than anything else, is before I arrive in the hospital room, and before anyone shows up in the funeral home, or before anyone shows up at Starbucks or wherever the meeting is, before anyone is there, long before anyone was scheduled to be there, Jesus was there first. There's a moment when you walk into an empty funeral home on the day of a funeral where if you're ever the first one there, if you've ever experienced this, you'll know I'm not telling a fib. This is a true thing. You walk into an empty funeral home and you can tell that you're not the first one there. That God was there long before you and will be there long after you leave. There's a moment in that sacred space of confidence and trust when someone is bearing the news that's changing the course of their life, that God was working in that news long before you heard it. When Jesus tells the disciples that he is going on ahead of them, it wasn't only to Galilee. It was everywhere. He's always been 5 steps ahead of us. Ever since the resurrection, he's always been ahead of you. There's never been a moment when you went to the ER and had to phone Jesus and say, hey, do you mind sitting with me in the ER, because he was there before you got there. It's the truth of it. And it sounds silly, I know, but think of how you pray. Think about how you talk to God when these moments in life happen. Any sort of feelings of isolation or surprise or distance from God is not the truth of it. It's the lie that the deceiver tells us. Any sort of isolation you feel or distance from God you feel in those moments in life are put there to distract you from the truth. And the truth is, he's ahead of you. He's always been ahead of you. When you changed jobs, he was ahead of you. When you moved to a new place, he's moved on first. He arrived before the truck did, long before you got there, waiting for you to welcome you into this next part of your life. He's moved on. He's gone on ahead of you. He goes on ahead of you before you find out your loved one has gone. And he's already taken them to the place he's made for them in heaven before he comes back here to comfort you. He was 5 steps ahead of you the whole time. The tomb has always been empty on Easter because long before you found out he was risen, he was already busy making preparations for you. And the only other way I know how to explain that is the most un-Eastery thing I could possibly say. Any of you like to watch curling in the Winter Olympics? Show of hands, curling. Saw one small hand, good. There we go, curling. Jesus is the guy with the little sweeper broom. It's always been that way. When you watch curling, it's not a sport of strength. I mean, yeah, it's a big rock. It's got to take some muscle, I'm sure, but it's a technicality thing. It's all about physics and math and getting the things in the right places at the right time and getting the rocks to hit each other just right. There's a couple of people on a curling team. There's somebody who hurls the stone down the ice, and then there's a couple of people with little bitty tiny squeegee brooms that are trying to make the ice the right texture and the right consistency to make sure the stone goes where it's supposed to go. Long before that granite rock from Scotland goes anywhere, there's somebody with a broom trying to make sure things are ready for it when it gets there. And you don't usually see that from your point of view. You're just the rock going down the ice, and that's all you can see. But long before you ever get where you're going, long before you ever hit something else or run up against a wall or any of those things, there's this Jesus who's 5 steps ahead of you, preparing the way for whatever happens next in your life. What do you do with that information? What do you do knowing that Jesus is always ahead of you? I think you rest easy. You go to bed tonight and you sleep well, knowing that there's not a moment where you're apart, that he knows what's happening next, he knows where you're going, and he's already working things in your favor to make sure that when you get wherever it is that you're going next, Jesus is already there waiting for you. If that's a moment of pain, he already has the tissues. If it's a moment of joy, he is ready to pop the confetti. It doesn't matter which way you're headed. Whatever happens next in your life, you go into it always knowing with confidence that the tomb is empty because Jesus isn't there. He's the next place, always the next. Easter is only miraculous because Jesus doesn't stay in the tomb. This Easter story is only meaningful because he's not there gloating when the disciples show up. He's not there waiting to say his "I told you so's." He's not there waiting to say, "You were wrong and I was right." He's next, always on the next, always on the next thing, the next place. I don't know what's around the corner for you. I know some of your corners. Some of you are moving in the near future. And that's exciting and scary all at the same time. And I can confidently tell you there's not a place you could move on this earth where Jesus doesn't arrive before your truck. He's already waiting for you. Take comfort in that. Find peace in that. I don't know if you're waiting for something to happen in your life that could be bad or could be good, and you don't know which way it's going to turn out. It doesn't really much matter because no matter what that thing is, Jesus is already there. The good thing about that empty tomb is knowing that the one place Jesus isn't is in the past. He's always in your future. Easter isn't a celebration of something that happened 2,000 years ago. Easter Sunday is a celebration of what's happening tomorrow. Always has been, always will be. We don't gather to remember just a story. We gather to remember where Jesus isn't so that we can find him everywhere else. The one place Jesus isn't in all of creation is that tomb. The other place that he is everywhere. The disciples grabbed Jesus by his feet and they worshiped him, and Jesus says, "Don't be afraid of what comes next. I'm going ahead of you. Don't be afraid of tomorrow or the day after or the year after that or the things in life that threaten you. Don't stress about those things because I'm going there first and I'll clear the way. You just follow me. Hold on tight and I'll drag you across the floor. I'll let you sit on my leg and I'll carry you through it all. But I'm going there next, and I'll make sure everything's ready for you when you get there. I'm going to prepare a place for you in my Father's house with lots of dwellings, and it's going to be great." Easter Sunday isn't today. Easter Sunday is always tomorrow. Whether it's a Monday or a Tuesday or a Wednesday, doesn't matter. The hope of Easter is the trust and faith and the knowledge that Jesus goes ahead of us. So come to this table this morning, find a body broken, but more importantly, find an empty tomb. And as you go back to your seats, keep looking. You never know where you might find Jesus, but I guarantee you it's in whatever happens next. Let's stand and sing.